You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 6th of March, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
It's 3 a.m. in Tokyo, 1900 in Brussels, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Washington, D.C. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. How wide is France's nuclear umbrella? Asking for a continent. The ongoing efforts of Syria's new government to reposition themselves as a reasonable bunch of chaps. And an end to armchair policing in Switzerland. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Daniella, Peled and Marion Messmer will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is a letter from Damascus. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Dr. Marion Messmer, Senior Research Fellow in International Security at Chatham House, and by Daniella Peled, Managing Editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. Hello to you both.
Hello.
By way of light introductory banter, I thought we would begin by giving our listeners an idea of a week in the life of the zany, crazy rock and roll stuff that you both get up to. So, Daniella, which local history museums have you been visiting recently, or are you planning shortly to visit?
Well, I'm thinking of a thematic sort of venture, which is local hospital. Medical museums. I don't know if you've noticed this, if you've ever been for a checkup, but most hospitals have their own little...
I did not know this.
Well, do so. And in London, you're in for an extra treat, because they're usually founded by the medieval order of this or that. Or they have some famous people with it, or they have some connection to slavery. So that gives you another local history angle. But my plans have been rather thrown into disarray, because I've just heard about Reading Local History Museum, which I can't believe I've never visited, and it sounds like an absolute whopper.
Has literally anything ever happened in Reading?
Over to you, Marion.
I mean, lots happens in Reading all the time, Andrew. But also Reading Hospital also has a hospital museum. So there really is something there for everyone, whether you're interested in town history or whether you're interested in medical history.
See, I got a bit caught up there, Daniella, with your reference to the medieval order of this and that. I was depicting some indecisive knights. I mean, presumably Reading Jail, do they have some sort of commemoration of its most famous inmate?
I don't actually know. It is still a working jail. We have a Banksy on the wall, so that's quite cool.
There are those of us that might prefer that Banksy was on the other side of it. That's just a personal judgment. But Reading, Daniella, are you now agog to visit Reading?
I really am, and I think Marion should be the brand ambassador. She really talks it up a storm.
This is so funny. All my friends basically say that I should get commission for people who visit Reading, which is really funny to me. So, yeah, visit Reading.
Okay, well, I can't think of a seamless pivot out of visiting Reading to where we're starting. So we'll just start. And we are starting in Europe, which by now feels like it is hosting a more or less continuous emergency summit, attempting to address two concurrent difficulties. One is Russia's 3-year-long pillaging of Ukraine. The other, the more recent signalling by the United States that it has grown increasingly indifferent not only to the fate of Ukraine, but the security of Europe. Among suggestions emerging from the latest conclave in Brussels, which Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is attending, a coalition of the willing of perhaps 20 countries from Europe and beyond who may be amenable to sending troops to Ukraine to uphold any agreement reached. Before we get into this, we will hear first of all from European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
This is a watershed moment for Europe. And Ukraine, as part of our European family, it's also a watershed moment for Ukraine. Europe faces a clear and present danger, and therefore Europe has to be able to protect itself, to defend itself, as we have to put Ukraine in a position to protect itself and to push for a lasting and just peace. We want a peace through strength.
I feel like, Marion, that if I had 10 euros for every time in the last 10 years I've heard some or other European panjandrum say this is a watershed moment for Europe, I could personally underwrite the rearmament of Germany. Does it sound like they're serious this time?
I think things have changed significantly, if only because of this massive increase in defense spending all across Europe. I hear what you're saying about that kind of rhetoric coming out time and time again. And I mean, there was even in 2022, there was the announcement of the Zeitenwende, which then hasn't changed Germany quite as dramatically as some might have hoped. But at the same time, I think Europeans are incredibly worried about the direction that the Trump administration is traveling in. And certainly among those countries that have been supporting Ukraine, that have been sending weapons to Ukraine, that have been sending money to Ukraine, there really seems to be this worry that the Trump administration might not just be leaving Europe, which is something that's been on the table for a long time, but also might actually really be colluding with Russia and worsening European security in that direction. And I think that is what is the real difference now. It's that we're looking at a potential security environment that's not just without the US, but it's with a US that is closer to Russia than it is to the rest of the European states.
Daniella, President Emmanuel Macron of France spoke to France on television last night. One of the key quotes from what he had to say was, "I want to believe that the US will stay at our side, but we must be ready if that is not the case." Do we at last see Europe now actually, even if only theoretically, proceeding on the assumption that, OK, we can't trust the United States anymore, we do have to look after ourselves. If it turns out we can trust the United States, that's a bit of a bonus.
Well, I mean, to be fair, Macron is quite fond of making these sweeping, grandiose statements.
He has been known to.
He has been known to. And again, he just won't give up this sort of idea, I think, that he has of himself as the sort of foreign policy leader of Europe, although in no way is it borne out. And I'm confused, I'm sure I'm not anyone confused by his talk of widening France's nuclear umbrella, which brings up all kinds of strange imagery. Defence spending is something that really Europe can put its finger on. You can put figures on it. It's also an important part of our domestic industry. I mean, that's something that's really important to bear in mind for the UK, for Germany, for others. And it's something more concrete. I think really what needs to be borne in mind is that what Europe is facing from Russia is a hybrid threat. It's not as simple as a military threat. I mean, that's in a way that's sort of more simple, really. Boots on the ground. We understand what that involves. But there's an informational threat as well. The malign influence operations are. It's something of a cliche now. We talk about Russian disinformation. It's moved far, far beyond that. And it's really got it's a spread across Europe, all different parts of Europe, in parts of Europe that we would have thought were quite savvy to the Russian military threat. This idea of defence of the family and gender politics and the idea of wokery, all of these things is a way, I think, that it's a wedge in which Russia is also exerting its influence. So there's the defence aspect, but there's also a political aspect, which I still think that we are somewhat sleepy about.
On the subject of that nuclear umbrella, Marion, and the possible extension of it, another thing Macron said last night was, "Our nuclear deterrence protects us. It is complete, sovereign, French from end to end." Is he reminding everybody there that potentially the United Kingdom's is actually quite vulnerable because the United Kingdom's nuclear deterrent is, of course, the US-supplied Trident?
Well, I mean, there are aspects of the UK nuclear capabilities that are independent. So it's not. It wouldn't immediately be vulnerable to a US withdrawal, and
in the longer term, then.
in the longer term, it would be vulnerable. That's correct, and but at the same time, it is also guarded by agreements that have actually recently been strengthened in 2024 when they had to be re-signed, probably with an eye to a potential Trump administration. So so far, the US hasn't said anything about wanting to withdraw from those agreements, and it would also be a lot more difficult now than it would have been previously to withdraw from them. I think what he also reminded us all of, actually, though, is that the UK already has dedicated its nuclear weapons to NATO deterrence, whereas France hasn't. So this idea about a European nuclear umbrella is something that has come up time and time again, especially in the last few years. And Macron has made a range of different proposals for what that could look like. But what's really interesting to me is that even though France is a member of NATO, they are not in the nuclear planning group, and they reserve their nuclear weapons for national defense only. And if they really wanted to actually be part of European nuclear deterrence, then a really simple step would be simply to dedicate their nuclear weapons to NATO in the same way that the UK is already doing. That wouldn't require any movements of planes or anything. It would simply be a policy change. And so I think until we see such a significant policy step, it's more of an abstract idea.
Daniella, to return to the matter at hand, the people meeting in Brussels today have been trying to come up with some sort of coherent plan. I think this is a response to the idea that they're going to get frozen out of this by the US and Russia sorting this all out between them. What we have heard is this idea of a limited 4-week ceasefire, not on land, but at sea and in the air, though Russia has said they're not terrifically interested in this. Zelensky wants that, plus an exchange of prisoners to establish trust. We will get into that shortly, but here is some of what President Zelensky had to say earlier.
All this period and last week, you stay with us, and of course from all the Ukrainians, from all our nations, big appreciation. We are very thankful that we are not alone, and these are not just words, we feel it.
I mean, is there an argument, Daniella, that this is kind of what the United States has been hoping to achieve by taking the extreme and indeed obnoxious position that they have, hoping that this will bounce the Europeans at last into getting their act together?
Well, it's certainly provoked a climb down from Zelensky, you know, if you see that as success. The issue is, though, all us followers of foreign policy debates and wonks and academics, we have all these like great ideas about what will make peace and how the complex histories and what will be sustainable and the steps you have to take. And if you have an actor that comes in and says, actually, that's not on the table. What we need is action. That throws everyone into disarray. Again, I think it's not about having an agreement. The parameters of the agreement, I guess, are more or less there and more or less realistic, and it involves compromise, and no one is going to be particularly happy. And it's not necessarily going to involve a whole lot of justice. But it's whether it's sustainable, and whether it's sustainable for the wider European threat that we see. It's not something theoretical. If you look at places like Moldova or Georgia, if you look at Bosnia, you know, Europe is facing this very, very real Russian threat of instability. So the day after you sign this peace agreement with Ukraine, everyone is miserable, apart from perhaps Vladimir Putin. What next? What happens the day after? And there isn't a path forward to that there's any kind of consensus, or certainly not a transatlantic consensus on.
Well, there's probably not either, Marion, entirely an internal Europe consensus either, because within the EU and indeed within NATO, there are countries who are not on board for this, and they're not terribly big, and one might argue not terribly important countries, thinking most obviously of Hungary and Slovakia, but in an arrangement like the EU and NATO, everybody gets a say. And this is why we're hearing talk about a coalition of the willing. But assuming such a thing can be got together, and this won't just be Europe, there's even talk of countries as far afield as Australia contributing to this. Does that run the risk of undermining NATO if it sort of turns out that there's a strata of more serious and committed countries within NATO that will just act without the awkward squad?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the biggest risk of undermining NATO is actually what we're seeing from the US at the moment, you know, being willing to backstab allies and potentially withdraw further from the alliance. NATO has a long history of various coalitions of the willing, because NATO is essentially voluntary anyway. So all the nation states put in what they want to put in. And we already have various states stepping up in different areas. So I think in that sense, that's something that the alliance can cope with. And those kind of frameworks often actually help with alliance cohesion more broadly because, states get to know each other better, they get to understand each other better, and they practice working together, which then benefits the alliance. But what I am really worried about is whether states like Hungary and Slovakia will feel emboldened if the US essentially also moves closer to Russia. And then you might have this bigger tension in NATO of more pro-Russian states and less pro-Russian states.
Well, on which subject we did also hear in the last day or so from Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign policy chief, former Prime Minister of Estonia. She had this to say.
This is increasingly difficult, and that's why we have on the new initiatives also considered the coalition of the willing, so that one country can't block everybody else.
So just finally on this, Daniella, this is going to necessitate solid agreement among serious countries to do big things. But we have been, if not quite this far before, we've been in the vicinity of this far before. Do you anticipate that anything is now meaningfully going to change?
Well, I think Europe is having a common enemy, having sharpened their focus. I'll leave it to you to decide who exactly is the common enemy. But actually, I would disagree about this the solidarity or consensus. I think I actually over the last 3 years it's been quite surprising how resolute Europe has been. And I'm sure that Putin's calculation was that 1 winter of high energy prices and the people of Europe would demand that their governments capitulate. And that actually hasn't happened. We've had a huge amount of popular sympathy towards Ukrainians, whereas refugees or as symbols of a fight against oppression, I think Europe has been shown to be a little bit more resilient than we might have thought. But again, it's never been possible. A common security policy has always been something that they've struggled with. I think we're closer to it, but I think that I think we're not done yet as a body of as a body of countries, a majority of countries in support of Ukraine. I think that resilience is still there.
Well, to the Middle East now, where one does not lightly tempt the fates by suggesting that a given development might be good news, but let's give it a try, see how far we get. Syria's new Foreign Minister, Assad al-Shibani, has told a gathering of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons that the government he represents is committed to destroying any or all of what remains of the chemical weapon stockpiles that the previous regime of Bashar al-Assad always denied it had ever used during the country's civil war. A line nobody serious took seriously. Elsewhere, in less joyous developments, US President Donald Trump has had some further thoughts about Palestine. Daniella, we will get to those presently, but where Syria is concerned, everybody is still trying to figure out that thing of, are these people who a matter of months ago were regarded as Kalashnikov-waving jihadists? Are we buying the transition into apparently reasonable, grown-up, responsible leaders of a new country? Well,
the thing is, I think the answer to that is neither yes or no. It's really not. We can't really categorise it like that. And I think it's certainly a sensible move. It makes a lot of sense on so many levels, although I think we should also remember that immediately after the fall of the Assad regime, Israel, with full backing of Western governments, went in and destroyed really quite a lot of arms supplies. I imagine also unconventional weapons. They probably have a better idea of where they are than many of us. But I mean, on one level, I think, well, this is good news. If they can operate as a reasonable government. But at the same time, I don't see that as in the long term having a very good impact on human rights, the rights of women, girls, and so on and so forth. But I think really we also assume, maybe in the West, in a slightly colonial way, that all these guys are the same and they're all running around with Kalashnikovs and they just want to see global jihad. And the situation is much more complex than that, obviously. And there is people also play along with their immediate needs and their strengths. How would holding on to this a stockpile of chemical weapons with no real, I doubt, any ability to deliver quite complex operations, how would that do them any good? You gain much more diplomatically by showing your openness to this. Also, you also gain by showing your openness to this, perhaps not actually getting that far with it. I mean, that's fine. That's also how it works. And in international relations, just the fact that they've done this now is making them statesperson-like, I should say. And so that in itself,
I think they'd be pretty happy with statesman-like.
I think, well, yeah, but let's. So yeah, I think that is the significant part of all this. I doubt they're sitting on a big stockpile of sarin.
Further encouraging signs in that department, though, even if it is somewhat theatrical, as Daniella suggests, Marion, that Shabani, the Syrian foreign minister, has talked of OPCW inspectors actually going to Syria and has so far suggested, have at it, go where you like and look at what you want to. He has also met prosecutors from the International Criminal Court, though it's debatable how much point there is to that, because Syria is obviously not a signatory and Bashar al-Assad is in Russia, and I suspect he's probably staying there. But do signals like that mean anything? Clearly, he's doing it for a reason.
I think it depends on whether he follows through on this, right? I mean, I was really glad to hear about the suggestion that chemical weapons would be destroyed. In part, of course, because of all the damage that they have done in the civil war in Syria. But also because Syria and Russia together have actually done a lot of damage to the overall regime of outlawing chemical weapons, which prior to the conflict in Syria had actually been a pretty solid regime. And so I think it at a time when we are losing a lot of other arms control agreements and when a lot of other international agreements are essentially falling apart, it's really nice to see that potentially the Chemical Weapons Convention is one that could be strengthened again and where states could essentially come back into compliance. But the question remains whether he's going to follow through on that. And I think, once we actually have the inspectors in country and once there are reports and that sort of thing, that would be really encouraging. But until then, I'm going to take it as a silver lining in a pretty bleak landscape, and I'll cross my fingers.
Daniella, elsewhere in the Middle East, US President Donald Trump has once again conveyed his regards to the people of Gaza, issuing a last warning to Hamas. I feel like it's not his first last warning, and has also said, and I quote, "Also to the people of Gaza, a beautiful future awaits, but not if you hold hostages. If you do, you are dead." Is anybody listening to him, do you think?
I think people do actually listen to what the President of the United States says. I mean, we had a conference by Arab states talking about the reconstruction of Gaza. What was it, $53 trillion? I mean, some sort of
$53 billion.
Billion, trillion. I mean, some made up number. But, that's the kind of response I'm sure that the White House is happy to see. Other people are going to pay for it, that there is some sort of plan, some sort of infrastructure. Hovering over all of this is still the idea of normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I mean, this was always going to be the most perilous part of the ceasefire, and I'm not sure that there's much hope of it progressing, because this comes down to actual movement on cessation of hostilities, and all the concessions that certainly the Israeli government doesn't want to make. I mean, it sounds brutal to say this, but how the hostage deal was going to play out was kind of clear already on the 8th of October. That's how these things happen. I mean, there's never been a hostage taking of such a scale in Israel before, but in all previous rounds, you had civilians or soldiers. The hostages, you would have some military actions, and then there would be a hostage release. There's no other way. And this could, the Israeli public, many voices are very angry about this because they say this could have happened and should have happened a long time ago. And the people who are left there, I mean, maybe it's faded from the international stage. Within Israel, they're incredibly familiar figures. This is really a source of great tension. The only way that they're going to be released is through further prisoner exchanges. No other way.
Marion, it's Well, one of the things I think does need to be figured out by anybody who is trying to participate in the reconstruction and remaking of Gaza is to figure out at this point who and what Hamas still is, because it's not by definition the same organisation it was on October 7th, 2023. Its senior leadership are all dead. So is quite a lot of its officer class. But as they have rather grotesquely demonstrated in these little productions they've staged around the hostage releases, they are still a thing. They do still have, people under arms. They do still have equipment. But do we yet know what they actually want?
I certainly don't know. And I think until there is a sort of Hamas leadership that has publicly reconstituted itself in a way that it's, trying to appeal to states, to the international public and so on, it's probably going to be not that clear what they're after. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're also scrambling, trying to figure out what they can reasonably ask for, given that the destruction of Gaza and Trump's various statements about what might be next for Gaza have really endangered any of the traditional two-state solutions or anything else that they might have wanted to push for. So I think they probably are not that clear on what they're looking for at this point either.
I think, there's some consensus for a technocratic government, a technocratic Palestinian government in Gaza, but the Israelis are taking a very maximalist approach and also saying that they're not willing to have the Palestinian Authority, who administrates the West Bank, involved, and also sort of refusing to accept the fact that every similar situation like this, where you have like an armed non-state actor, and there's been a peace deal, then there has been a transformation of a military wing into a political wing. That's just completely unacceptable for the Israeli public right now. So even if Hamas was willing to move forward in that direction, I don't think they would have fertile ground.
Well, two dejecting tidings now for certain Swiss police officers who may have been hoping to take the load off their feet. Cops on duty at the Federal Parliament building in Bern recently had their chairs removed after one of their number was spotted not diligently scanning the immediate vicinity for potential threats, but reading a newspaper. Despite protests from the footsore plod, it has been decided that they must remain upright. Even recently installed compromise bar stool sort of arrangements can only be availed of in emergency. Yes, it's a standing order. Marion, is a sedentary police officer necessarily less effective, do you think?
I would wonder how many immediate threats there are in Bern in the parliamentary area anyway, right, given that Switzerland is quite a safe place.
It would be quite a dull job, I will concede that.
Maybe a compromise could be to give them more comfortable shoes. I don't know what their uniform shoes are like, but if you have to stand a lot in your job, it helps to have cushioned shoes.
Is it fair? Uncharitable though this sounds, because as Marion correctly intimates, Daniella, it would be a dull way to make a living, standing. And that's literally what you would be doing, unless something really quite unprecedented in the entire history of the Swiss experiment occurred. But nevertheless, do we arrive at the fundamental point that somebody is being paid to do a job? And even if it is boring and uncomfortable, that's what you're being paid to do, so do it. He said in the comfortable chair from which he broadcasts.
I think it's also the image you project. London is a fairly crime-ridden city, and when I see Metropolitan Police officers whizzing along on mountain bikes, I can't say it gives me a great sense that they're doing something.
I'm impressed you've seen a Metropolitan Police officer.
If I was seeing them sort of, wearing trainers, lounging around, taking their ease, it just doesn't give you like a good vibe that these guys are in charge and vigilant.
See, Marion, our Tokyo correspondent, and such is the globe-spanning There was a word starting with consultant I was grasping for there. It's gone now. But anyway, such is the globe-straddling consulting that goes into this program. Our Tokyo correspondent informs us of a Japanese practice called ritsuban, which is basically just a police officer standing outside the station with a big stick. And the idea is that the stick is broadly more symbolic than actually effectual, but it is demonstrating that we're here, we exist, we are able to respond with a big stick or other equipment as may be necessary.
Yeah, I mean, London has a lot of symbolic guards like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the tourists love them, and they also actually have to stand all the time.
They often wearing very heavy hats.
Exactly, and they can't move all that much actually, so they can't even lean from one leg to the other. So maybe the Swiss police officers are complaining too much.
Because I know this is a conversation that gets had, Daniella, because whenever it's put to police that they should be more visible, that they should be sort of like plodding up and down the high street, they do point out that an officer doing that is not actually investigating crimes. But is there an argument that the deterrent effect balances that you give the idea that this neighbourhood is policed, it is patrolled, and you will be caught, and therefore the ne'er-do-wells take their business elsewhere?
I think where I live in London, that would probably have quite a good deterrent effect. I don't think they'd make it all the way down the street without some sort of form of violence or theft. But we have this sentimental attitude, don't we, towards the bobbies on the beat. I mean, I just noticed them getting younger and younger, more and more tattooed, and not really not Dixon of Dock Green, but who's that Scottish guy, Hamish Macbeth? Yeah, those days are over. Those days are over. Now, if I do see police officers in my neighbourhood, they are wearing stab vests, they have tasers, and they're looking quite gnarly. So I think they need to try quite hard to deter people.
Is it like that in Reading, Marion?
Reading also has a lot of community liaison officers that patrol around. I think it adds to the community feel.
And is yet one more good reason to visit.
Absolutely.
Marion Messmer and Daniella Peled, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our weekly letter from returns. This week it is from Damascus. Here is Monocle's Hannah Lucinda Smith.
One man dominated Damascus when I first visited the city in 2011. Pictures of Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, were hung on every public building and shop counter, sometimes glowering in military uniform with sunglasses, sometimes suited and smiling. Assad's palace squatted on a hilltop like a Bond villain's lair, watching over every corner of the city. On the Damascus streets, I saw the fear and paranoia that decades of Assad family dictatorship had brought. Kindly Syrians who offered me directions would point to the nearest Assad portrait, cover their hearts with their right hand, and smile. They knew what might happen if they didn't. The security branches of Assad's intelligence divisions, scores of them, dotted the Damascus highways, dung-coloured blocks with razor wire and bleak cell windows. Families living nearby heard the screams at night. But in February 2011, I also witnessed how this dictatorship was starting to crumble. The wave of Arab Spring revolution was breaching Assad's borders, and soon after I left the city, the protests against Assad exploded into full civil war. 14 years on, the regime has crumbled, Bashar al-Assad has fled the country for Moscow, and I'm back in Damascus, landing at the very same airport where his escape plane took off 2 months ago. I'd been able to return throughout the war. Assad's security forces cracked down on the pro-democracy demonstrations with instant brutality, firing live rounds on protesters and locking up scores of students, lawyers, doctors and intellectuals. Soon, the protests were overtaken by armed rebel factions which seized rural areas around Damascus and other parts of the country. The regime kept a tight leash on foreign journalists visiting the capital, and I chose to cover the war from areas under rebel control in the north of Syria instead, including Aleppo, the second city, where Assad's air force was unleashing relentless bombardments on crowded civilian neighbourhoods. My reporting from rebel areas had me blacklisted in Damascus. From the north, the capital felt like a foreign city, where Syrians were relatively sheltered from the fighting, but suffering under the growing oppression of Assad's intelligence forces. Those still inside the city passed on news of its conditions through carefully phrased telephone conversations with relatives who'd fled the country. Fuel became so expensive that Damascenes had taken to riding bicycles. Russian military vehicles were patrolling the streets. Israel was launching strikes on Iranian military assets in Damascus, but all the while, a small hard core of Damascene clubbers kept the city's underground techno scene going, even through the very worst days. Damascus felt like a mirage that I would never see again. So, coming back is a dizzying experience. There's sheer jubilation as the plane lands at Damascus airport. My flight from Istanbul is full of Syrians returning home for the first time in years. Sitting next to me is Mohammed, a wedding dress designer working in an upmarket district of Istanbul, who will see his mother for the first time in a decade. At the chaotic immigration desk, Syrians whose passports expired while they were in exile present their Turkish and European documents to the officer and pay to enter their own country as foreigners. In the centre, much is the same, only bruised. Friends have warned me that I'll find a sad version of the city. Nothing seems to have been fixed or cleaned for a decade. There are broken windows on almost every building. Sanctions have largely halted imports, and all the brands being sold in the street markets are local knockoffs. All the Syrians I speak with have lost someone in the war, said Naya Prison is the leveller. The missing notices are pinned up everywhere in the city centre, on columns and shop fronts, and around the historic Hijaz railway station. There are signs of how the end unfolded too. The Iranian embassy is looted, torched and graffitied. "Free Iran" reads the slogan in English. A Russian cultural centre close to the central bank stands empty behind barricades. The new Syrian flag, with 3 green stars rather than 2 red, is everywhere, and the time and date, 6/18, 8th of the 12th, 24, the exact time that Assad's plane took off and 54 years of dictatorship ended.
Stunning turn of events in Syria, rebels sweeping that country, seizing power, forcing President Bashar al-Assad to flee, toppling statues of Assad, cheering the end of the family's brutal half-century rule there.
Bashar al-Assad's face has been defaced down to the last poster, his every image scratched out or ripped down. All the jokes that Syrians stored up for 5 decades are pouring out. Traders in the Souk al-Hamadiyah sell socks decorated with unflattering caricatures of Bashar, with long neck and jug ears, and his brother Maher, beefed up and ridiculous in Speedos. At the airport, you walk in and out over rugs printed with Assad's face. I wonder what he must be thinking in his luxury purgatory in Moscow, and whether he follows the news from his lost country. A businessman gifts us a photo book of Syrian landscapes that was funded by his company. He'd been forced to include an obsequious dedication to Asmar al-Assad, Bashar's wife, at the front. He smiles before he hands it to us. "Do you mind?" he says, and rips the page out with a flourish. Most Syrians are cautiously optimistic. Even though the country's new rulers have fundamentalist Islamist roots, they can't be any worse than Assad, they say. Some fear that, in time, the government of rebel leader Ahmad al-Shara may bring new restrictions and fear into the lives of Syrians. But for now, and despite the challenges and hardships, they are enjoying the freedom to laugh, to debate, to criticise, and to dream of a better future for their country, which has been through so much. For Monocle in Damascus, I'm Hannah Lucinda Smith.
Thank you, Hannah. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Marion, Messmer and Daniella Peled. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Francesca Julks. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons, with editing assistance from Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.